I drove home that evening, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My thoughts raced through every possible explanation, trying to convince myself this was some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe my grandfather had agreed to some obscure HOA clause without realizing it. Maybe they had filed the wrong paperwork, or maybe, just maybe, this was all an elaborate scam that could be undone with a few phone calls. But deep down, I already knew the truth. They had stolen my inheritance, and they were banking on me not knowing how to fight back. That night, I barely slept. Instead, I dug through every document I had. The deed, my grandfather's will, his last few letters to me. Nowhere did it mention any HOA control over the inheritance. He had paid off the house years ago. There were no outstanding debts, no liens, nothing that could have justified the sale. The next morning, I made my first move. I called the county recorder's office. After an agonizing wait on hold, a tired-sounding clerk finally pulled up the property records. "According to our records," she said, "this property was transferred to the HOA after being declared unclaimed." I nearly dropped the phone. "Unclaimed?" "Excuse me," I said, my voice rising. "I claimed this property. My grandfathers will left it to me directly. There was never any dispute. How could it be unclaimed?" The woman hesitated, and I could hear her flipping through pages. "Well," she said slowly, "the HOA filed paperwork stating that the heir had not responded to their inquiries. Since you were under 25, they argued that you weren't of legal standing to own the home per their community guidelines, and after 6 months of no response, the home was officially transferred to their control." I stared at my laptop screen, my vision swimming. 6 months? I had been in college, but I checked my mail, my emails, my phone religiously. If anything had come through, I would have seen it. "Can I see those documents?" I asked. "The ones where they claim to have contacted me?" There was a long pause before she finally responded. "You'll have to submit a formal request for those," she said, her voice noticeably colder. "But I should warn you, if the sale has already gone through, getting it reversed will be incredibly difficult. Difficult, but not impossible." I hung up and immediately started looking for a lawyer. I had no experience with property law, no idea how to navigate the legal system. But I wasn't about to let this slide. After several hours of searching, I found an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, a middle-aged man named Daniel Carter, whose website boasted multiple victories against corrupt neighborhood associations. When I called his office and explained my situation, his assistant put me through to him directly. "Let me get this straight," Daniel said after I finished explaining. "Your HOA claimed you were too young to inherit your grandfather's property and used that as justification to sell it." "Yes," I said through gritted teeth. "And I never received any of the so-called notices they claimed to have sent." He sighed, and I could hear him scribbling something on paper. "This isn't the first time I've seen something like this," he admitted. "HOAs sometimes pull stunts like this when they think they can get away with it, especially when dealing with younger homeowners or people they assume won't fight back. They mess with the wrong person," I said flatly. He chuckled. "That's what I like to hear. But listen, this isn't going to be an easy fight. First, we need to get our hands on the sale records and the HOA's supposed communications with you. If they can't produce legitimate proof that they contacted you, we have a case for fraud. If we can prove they forged or withheld documents, even better." I felt a glimmer of hope. How do we get that information? "First, I'll send a formal demand for the HOA's records on your behalf. They're legally required to provide them, though I wouldn't be surprised if they drag their feet. In the meantime, I need you to do some digging. Talk to your neighbors, see if anyone else has had similar issues with them. The more we uncover, the stronger our case." The fire in my chest burned hotter. I thanked him and hung up, already planning my next move. If the HOA thought I was going to roll over and accept this, they had another thing coming. Gathering evidence. A web of corruption. The first person I reached out to was Mrs. Collins, an elderly widow who had lived across the street from my grandfather for as long as I could remember. If anyone had seen something suspicious, it was her. When I knocked on her door, she greeted me with a warm but sad smile. "I was wondering when you'd come by," she said, ushering me inside. I frowned. "You knew about the sale?" She sighed, sitting down at her kitchen table. "Honey, we all did. The HOA put the house up for sale within weeks of your grandfather passing. They claimed there was no heir." I clenched my fists. "That's a lie." "I know," she said bitterly. "I told them that, too. A few of us did. We even asked if they had reached out to you, and they insisted they had. But no one ever saw any paperwork, and when we pressed them, they told us to mind our own business." My blood boiled. "Did they say anything about the buyer?" She nodded. "A young couple. The husband works in real estate. They got the house for way below market value. Almost like the HOA was in a rush to get rid of it. I made a note to look into the buyers later, but for now, I had bigger problems." "Have they done this to anyone else?" She hesitated, then nodded. "There's a pattern. They tend to target homes owned by older folks, especially ones without a lot of immediate family nearby. A few houses have changed hands in ways that didn't sit right with us, but no one had the energy or resources to fight it. I left her house with a heavy weight in my chest, but a growing sense of determination. This wasn't just about me. The HOA had been doing this for years, quietly stealing homes from people who either didn't realize they had a right to fight or were too overwhelmed to do so. They counted on people giving up, but I wouldn't, confronting the HOA and hitting a wall, armed with what I had learned. I returned to the HOA office, this time with my phone recording in my pocket. When I demanded the records of my forfeiture, they stalled, claiming they needed time to retrieve them. "Fine," I said, my voice sharp. "I'll wait." The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. "It could take a few weeks." I narrowed my eyes. "Funny, considering you managed to process the sale in a matter of months. I'll be speaking with my lawyer in the meantime." At the mention of legal action, her expression soured. "You should be careful who you threaten," she said coolly. "The HOA operates within its rights." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "We'll see about that." As I left, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "They're stalling. We'll subpoena the records if we have to. Get ready for a fight." I smirked. Oh, I was ready. The moment I walked out of the HOA office, I knew I was in for the fight of my life. These people were prepared, ruthless, and, worst of all, experienced in exploiting homeowners who didn't know their rights. But what they hadn't counted on was my determination to undo the damage they had caused and bring them down for good. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, a small but well-organized firm that specialized in HOA disputes. Daniel Carter met me in the lobby, his sharp eyes already scanning my expression for answers. "Let me guess," he said as we sat down in his office. "They stonewalled you." I let out a bitter laugh. "They acted like they had no idea what I was talking about. Claimed they needed weeks to retrieve the records." He smirked. "Typical. They're hoping to exhaust you before you can do anything. But they made a mistake. They left a paper trail." Daniel wasted no time filing a formal demand for the HOA to provide every document related to the sale of my grandfather's house. He also sent out a subpoena request for any internal communications regarding my inheritance. "If they don't comply, we'll push for a court order," he assured me. HOAs like this don't expect people to fight back, but when they do, they crumble. But fighting back wouldn't be cheap. My stomach twisted when I saw the estimated legal fees. Between court filings, research, and litigation, I was looking at tens of thousands of dollars just to prove they stole my house. I knew I couldn't do this alone, uncovering the HOA's dark secrets. Determined to strengthen my case, I went back to the neighbors who had raised concerns about the HOA's shady practices. The more I dug, the worse it got. I met with James Parker, a middle-aged father whose parents had lost their home in a strikingly similar manner. "It was the same thing," he said grimly over coffee. They claimed my dad hadn't responded to their notices, but we never saw a single letter. By the time we figured it out, the house was gone. A pattern was emerging. The HOA had been systematically targeting older homeowners and younger heirs, banking on them not having the resources to fight back. Worse, I found at least 4 other families who had experienced the same treatment. The HOA would claim they sent notices, declare the property unclaimed, and flip it to new buyers, usually connected to the HOA board. One name kept coming up: David Reynolds, the HOA president. It didn't take long to find out why. A corrupt president and a shocking conflict of interest. Reynolds was a real estate investor on the side. Half of the homes forfeited by the HOA ended up in his company's hands. He would buy them for pennies on the dollar, then resell them for massive profits. This wasn't mismanagement, this was fraud. I gathered emails, sales records, and testimonies from affected homeowners. But I needed one final piece of the puzzle: proof that my house was stolen under false pretenses. The HOA's biggest lie exposed. One night, I got an email from an anonymous source. The subject line: "You need to see this." Attached was a leaked email chain from the HOA's internal communications. David Reynolds had ordered my grandfather's house to be declared unclaimed within days of his passing. There was zero attempt to contact me. The HOA had forged records to make it seem like they had sent letters, when in reality, they had moved to take my home immediately. The final email in the chain made my blood run cold. The heir won't fight this. He's young, probably doesn't even know the law. Let's move forward with the sale. Eddie, they had deliberately stolen my home, assuming I'd be too naive to do anything about it. They were wrong. Taking the fight to court, with my evidence compiled, Daniel filed a lawsuit against the HOA for fraudulent sale, wrongful property seizure, and financial damages. The case was bigger than just my house. If we won, we could expose the entire scam and set a precedent for other victims. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. Their lawyers tried every trick in the book to get the case thrown out. They claimed I had waited too long to object. They argued that I had no standing to sue since the home had already been sold. Then came the bribery attempts. A week before the trial, I got a call from an unknown number. A man's voice, smooth and confident, offered me $100,000 to drop the lawsuit. It was more than double what my grandfather's house had sold for. I knew exactly who it was. David Reynolds. I gripped my phone tightly. "I don't want your dirty money," I said through clenched teeth. He sighed. "You don't know what you're getting into. You're young. You could walk away from this with a fresh start." I smiled. "You should be more worried about your own fresh start, David." I hung up. The courtroom showdown. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The case had drawn local media attention, and several families who had been victimized by the HOA were in attendance. Daniel presented irrefutable evidence: emails, financial records, testimonies from other victims. Then he played the leaked recording of my call with Reynolds. The courtroom went silent as the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reynolds," he said slowly, "do you deny that was your voice?" Reynolds looked pale. That's enough." The judge cut him off. After 3 grueling hours, the verdict was in. I won. The judge ruled that the HOA had fraudulently seized my property and ordered the sale to be reversed. But it didn't stop there. The HOA was fined hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Reynolds was investigated for criminal fraud. It was the beginning of the end for their corruption, reclaiming my home and my future. 3 months later, I stood on the porch of my grandfather's house, keys in hand. The battle had been exhausting, but I had won back what was mine. More importantly, I had exposed a system that preyed on the weak. I wasn't the only one who fought back. Several other victims sued the HOA, and by the end of the year, the association was completely dismantled. David Reynolds? Disgraced, bankrupt, facing criminal charges. As I walked through the familiar halls of my grandfather's home, I felt something I hadn't in months: peace. I had done what my grandfather would have wanted. I had fought, and I had won, and no HOA would ever steal from me or anyone else again. The war wasn't over yet. Winning the lawsuit was a massive victory, but I wasn't naive enough to think that the HOA's corruption ended with my case. David Reynolds might have been exposed, but he wasn't the only one responsible. The entire HOA board had been complicit in years of fraudulent sales, forced evictions, and illegal property transfers. I had my house back, but that wasn't enough. I wanted to ensure that this never happened again to anyone. Over the next few weeks, my life was consumed by legal battles, media interviews, and uncovering the deeper web of corruption. People began coming forward with even more horror stories. Elderly homeowners whose houses had been seized over minor HOA violations, families who had been forced out after missing payments they swore they never received, and heirs like me who had lost their properties to fraudulent HOA sales. I quickly realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about my HOA. This was happening all over the country. A bigger conspiracy and more powerful enemies. With the lawsuit behind me, Daniel and I started working with a group of homeowners, rights attorneys who had spent years fighting similar cases. They confirmed my suspicions. Shady HOAs and predatory real estate investors work together in countless communities to exploit legal loopholes and seize homes under false pretenses. David Reynolds was just one of many. The bigger fish were the corporate real estate firms that backed corrupt HOAs for profit. I started digging deeper into Reynolds' past, following the money, and what I found left me shaking with rage. David Reynolds wasn't just an HOA president who happened to dabble in real estate. He was an executive for a massive investment company that specialized in acquiring undervalued properties. And that company had ties to multiple HOA boards across the country. Whistleblowers and the breaking point. It wasn't long before I received an anonymous message in my inbox from someone claiming to be a former HOA employee. The email was brief but explosive. They knew. They planned this for years. I have proof. I set up a meeting in a public place, a crowded cafe with security cameras. A nervous-looking woman in her late 30s arrived, her hands trembling as she slid a folder across the table. "I worked as an assistant in the HOA office," she whispered. "I processed paperwork for these forfeited homes. They told me it was all legal, that it was just part of the community rules. But when I saw the emails, I knew." The folder contained internal memos, forged notices, and direct orders from Reynolds and his associates instructing staff to file fake forfeiture claims as quickly as possible after a homeowner's death. There was even a training manual outlining legal justifications to deny heirs their properties. It was bigger than I had ever imagined. This wasn't incompetence. This was organized fraud, and I was about to blow it wide open, going public and facing retaliation. Daniel and I took the evidence to the state attorney general and filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing. Meanwhile, I reached out to investigative journalists who had been covering predatory real estate practices. The story exploded. How corrupt HOAs are stealing homes across America. The headline blared across every major news outlet. But with publicity came retaliation. The night after the story broke, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering as I grabbed my phone and peered out the window. A brick had been thrown through my front window. Taped to it was a single sheet of paper with one word: "Stop." My blood ran cold. I immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the street was empty. There were no security cameras nearby. "This is intimidation," Daniel said grimly the next morning. "You're hitting nerves. They want you to back off." I refused. I wasn't going to let them scare me into silence. Instead, I doubled down. I went on national TV, exposing everything. The fraudulent home seizures, the falsified documents, the corporate real estate firms backing these crimes. I named names, called out the investors profiting from illegal HOA practices, and demanded a full federal investigation. And it worked. The fall of a corrupt empire. Within weeks, The FBI launched an investigation into Reynolds' company and its ties to multiple HOA boards. The Department of Justice began a fraud probe into illegal home forfeitures. Then came the class action lawsuits. Families who had lost their homes to fraudulent HOA claims filed lawsuits against Reynolds' firm and multiple other real estate investment groups. And the dominoes started to fall. David Reynolds was arrested for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Multiple HOA officials were indicted after evidence surfaced that they had accepted bribes to facilitate fraudulent sales. And the company that had backed Reynolds? They went into damage control mode, scrambling to deny involvement. But the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the case led to massive reforms in HOA regulations across the country. Laws were changed to prevent HOAs from seizing homes without due process. State governments began cracking down on fraudulent forfeitures, making it harder for predatory real estate investors to manipulate HOA rules. Reflections and moving forward. I stood on the front porch of my grandfather's house, staring out at the quiet street where my battle had begun. It had taken years of legal fights, media pressure, and relentless determination, but in the end, I had not only reclaimed my home, I had helped protect countless others from falling into the same trap. The HOA was gone. The corrupt officials were behind bars. And the movement that had started with my fight had spread across the country, forcing real change in how HOAs operated. I had my house back, but more importantly, I had my justice. And I had proven them wrong. They thought I was too young, too inexperienced, too weak to fight back. But in the end, I won. And I made sure no one else would ever have to go through what I did. The end